Much like how the Homicide Desk is mostly based around real-life unsolved murders, the Vice Desk is mostly based around movies. Black Caesar, for instance, is the name of a 1970s blaxploitation remake of Little Caesar, a classic, groundbreaking 1931 gangster movie. However, I'm not going to be covering either of those today. Instead, I'm going to go with what's possibly the first Hollywood film to take a long, honest look at America's drug problem. The movie of the day is called The Man with the Golden Arm, which was also very much a groundbreaking film. The story about the story. When you think about the name Frank Sinatra, the first thing you think of is probably his career as a singer in the nightclubs and casinos of Las Vegas. And that's not for nothing. He did spend a lot of time and energy there, especially during his later years. Singing is also how he broke into Hollywood in the first place. He knew he wanted to sing for a living straight out of high school, and in 1940, when he was 24 years old, he got his first big break when he joined Tommy Dorsey's big band. Throughout the mid-40s, Sinatra had a fairly successful solo career, and also showed up in a few movies, usually in roles that let him sing. He also became a member of what would be called the Rat Pack, along with Humphrey Bogart. Reportedly, the name comes from a time when Lauren Bacall, remember her, saw her husband and his friends the morning after a night out drinking and called them a pack of rats. Sadly, Bogart died in 1957 thanks to esophageal cancer brought on by years of smoking. And after that, the Rat Pack was more or less a name for Sinatra's group of friends. The best-known members are Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr., but other recognizable names include Katharine Hepburn, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and Shirley MacLaine. In the late 40s and early 50s, Sinatra's career was in a slump, but it came back to life in 1953 when he won an Oscar for a supporting role in the war film From Here to Eternity. He doesn't sing in that movie, but it did give him enough fame and attention to land a new recording contract soon afterwards. His next big film is the one we're covering today, which came out in 1955, and which earned him an Oscar nomination for Best Actor. In later years, he would appear in films like the original Ocean's 11 and the original Manchurian Candidate. The Man with the Golden Arm started out as a book, and the book was some rather scathing social commentary about how American society is designed to keep the poor man down. There are still plenty of elements of this in the film, but it's considerably toned down, much to the book author's dismay. Now, you may recall from my review of Intolerance that I don't appreciate it when a work tries to make up my mind for me. So personally, I'd say the movie is better off for making it more about person versus self and person versus others, and only implying the person versus society. The movie did also change quite a bit about the wife, though, and I'm not as certain that doing so was the best idea. Still, even without accusing society at large, The Man with the Golden Arm was very much anti-Hollywood establishment. Specifically, under the Hays Code, absolutely no illicit drugs or drug paraphernalia could be shown on camera, and it was especially taboo to show someone actually using drugs. It didn't matter whether the drug use was glorified or condemned. Exceptions were made for small-time propaganda movies like Reefer Madness, but even they were constrained by the whims of the state censorship boards. Following the Miracle decision in 1952, however, the Hollywood Production Office's word was no longer law. In 1953, Otto Preminger directed the adaptation of a play called The Moon is Blue, which is a romantic comedy about two guys who want to have sex with the same woman. Not marry, just sex. This was against both the letter and the spirit of the production code, so the MPAA refused to approve it. Preminger released it anyway through United Artists, and it became the first major successful release to not bear the MPAA-approved logo since the early 1930s. Preminger's next controversial release was The Man with the Golden Arm, and its success paved the way for modern films like Trainspotting, Requiem for a Dream, and Through a Scanner Darkly. the story. We begin with our protagonist, Frankie Machine, whose name is actually a coincidence, coming home to a beat-up, run-down part of Chicago. His first stop is a bar where a drug dealer is forcing a crippled war veteran to dance for a glass of alcohol, and the first person he meets is Sparrow, a flighty guy with thick glasses, who's busy dyeing a pale dog dark and complaining about how no one leaves their pets out for him to kidnap and resell anymore. For his part, Frankie is doing great, and assures everyone that the monkey on his back is gone now. He also brings in a drum, a gift from his prison bandmates once his sentence came up. His old dealer, Louis, offers to take him back to his place to get a hit of the old stuff, but Frankie turns him down. Louis takes him at his word, but the last thing he says is, "I'll be around." Frankie walks off with Sparrow and talks about how he's going to make it big playing the drums. He's going to talk with a guy who gets jobs for a lot of ex-junkies. But he's going to need a good suit for the interview, so Sparrow promises to find him one. Frankie then goes to see his wife, Zash, short for Sophia, who is confined to a wheelchair. She immediately smothers him with kisses and tears. She was very alone, she says, and Frankie's old boss, Schweifka, didn't pay her the money he promised, despite the fact that Frankie went to prison for 6 months because they raided his illegal gambling hall. Zash is very affectionate, but she becomes dismayed when Frankie talks about playing the drums now, despite how he explains that learning to play is part of his cure. She rather desperately wants him to go back to dealing for Schweifka, go back to the way things were, even though Frankie's rehab doctor told him that falling back into his old habits will very likely hook him on drugs again. Downstairs, Frankie sets up his interview, greets his downstairs neighbor, Molly, along with her pushy boyfriend, and then Sparrow comes by with a brand new suit he says he borrowed from a place that ran on the honor system. As he's getting dressed, Zash is even more demanding that Frankie spend time with her instead of going to the interview, and after everyone leaves, she stands up and watches them exit the building. Stands up out of her wheelchair. Now, I should note that there are people who use wheelchairs and have some limited mobility, but she doesn't struggle to walk, and it's not a good sign that she waited for everyone to leave and locked the door before standing up. Frankie stops by the bar again on his way to the interview and meets Schweifka, the final main character. Schweifka basically begs Frankie to take his job back without actually begging, but Frankie turns him down cold. Immediately afterwards, 2 cops pick Frankie and Sparrow up for shoplifting, forcing him to miss the interview and locking him up in the station jail. Schweifka shows up soon after and promises to get Frankie out if he deals for him again, making it pretty clear who tipped off the police in the process. Frankie reluctantly agrees, and he's particularly unnerved when a junkie in the same cell goes through a breakdown from needing a fix. During the card game later that night, Frankie's hands begin to shake. Sure enough, his old job has got him craving again, and he excuses himself for a quick smoke. Louis, who is at the game, follows him and offers to set him up again, but Frankie ignores him. Just like last time, Louis promises, "I'll be around." Frankie heads over to Club Safari, a strip joint where Molly works as a server. Turns out the two are close friends, and unlike Zash, Molly is actually supportive of Frankie's change of profession. Also, Molly's boyfriend isn't just pushy, he's also a hopeless alcoholic who uses her to get money. Frankie knows Molly deserves better than that, but he refuses to go any further with her himself, so long as his wife is stuck in that wheelchair. The next day, Frankie meets with his contact, Mr. Lang, who tells him that he's only giving him one chance, and if he screws it up and goes back on the habit, that's it. It's harsh, but considering how many recovering addicts he helps, he can't really afford to offer second chances. For the next few scenes, Frankie is waiting for a call from Lang, as Zash keeps telling him to give up, and she sees an obvious quack of a doctor named Domanowski. Zash takes this opportunity to describe the car accident that supposedly left her paralyzed. 3 years ago, Frankie was driving drunk and caused the crash. which is why he felt guilty enough to marry her and to stay with her despite her attitude. That, and she really does love him in her own obsessive way. But hearing her go on and on about it finally builds up enough stress in Frankie for him to return to Louis's place for a hit of what may be heroin or morphine, but which opioid it is doesn't really matter all that much aside from the dosage. Sometime later, Zosh and Frankie are arguing again, and finally, Zosh tells him to take his drums down to his girlfriend and give her the headache. Frankie insists that he hasn't so much as spoken to Molly, but Zosh refuses to believe him. He goes out to the bar to get away from her and to get another hit, but while he's there, he meets Molly again, and she talks him into calling Lang back. Turns out, Lang lost Frankie's number, and he gets an audition next Monday. In exchange for her encouragement, Frankie talks Molly into dumping her bum of a boyfriend and sets his drums up in her apartment. A few days pass, and Frankie is finally feeling good. His cravings are down, he's focused on his drumming, and he's leaving both Schweifka and Louis behind. Unfortunately, the two of them aren't very happy about this, since they recently talked a couple of high rollers into joining their game, and Frankie was their selling point. They go up to Frankie's apartment to talk to him, but they only encounter Zash. When Frankie gets home after joining the musicians union, Zosh flips out on him once again and claims that Schweifka and Louis threaten both her and Frankie with physical harm if he doesn't deal for them, which isn't true. And once again, she demands that things go back to the way they were before. Frankie goes to the bar to confront the two men, and they give him the good cop, bad cop routine. Schweifka threatens to do some permanent damage, but then Louis offers $250 for one night of dealing, and Frankie accepts. Louis then talks to Frankie about how he gave up candy because the army discovered he was pre-diabetic back during World War II, and how the night before he officially quit, he gorged himself on $18 worth of candy, gorged until he was sick, all so he could look back later and say, for one day, he had had all the sweets he could stand. Of course, opioids and sugar don't work the same way, but it manages to convince Frankie to indulge himself one last time. Later that evening, he stops by Molly at work, and she notices his irises are constricted, a telltale sign of opioid use. Disgusted, Molly runs home, packs her things, and leaves without a word. Frankie responds to this by getting another fix. The long game begins, and we see Frankie at his best, bluffing two experienced gamblers out of $1,000 in a single hand. One of them suggests he might be cheating, but Frankie always plays a clean game. When Sparrow opens the window and some light comes in, Frankie realizes it's past dawn on Sunday, and his dealing days are done. Schweifka tries to get him to stay, but he walks out, and so Schweifka starts dealing instead. Frankie goes home to get some sleep, but before he can, the craving sets in again, and Frankie is forced to head back to the game to beg Louis for a hit. But of course, Louis will only give Frankie a hit if he continues dealing for them. However, Frankie's exhausted, and he's going through withdrawal, and so he starts losing big. Hours later, desperate, Louis talks Frankie into cheating, but he's tired and jittery, he's never done a card trick for keeps, and the other players have been watching him like hawks. The first moment he tries something, they catch him, flip the table, and slap the shit out of Frankie. Everyone storms out, except Sparrow, and Frankie pushes him away. Frankie then goes to Louis's place to get that hit he promised, but Louis refuses since Frankie has no money and they didn't pay him since he lost the game. In response, Frankie smashes a chair over Louis's head and ransacks the place, looking for but not finding his drug stash. Frankie only stops when he realizes he's late for his audition, which goes about as well as you could expect under the circumstances. At the very least, Frankie maintains some dignity by walking out on his own after he screws up. Frankie goes back to his own place to try and find some money, but when he has no luck, he runs back out, narrowly avoiding Louis, who saw him go in and wants a little payback. Since Frankie slipped by, Louis doesn't find him, but he does find Zash up and walking about. Louis laughs and thinks that she and Frankie are running some sort of long con, but when he threatens to tell others she can walk, Zash pushes him over the staircase rail, killing him. Incidentally, this is probably the biggest single change from the book. In the book, Zash couldn't walk because of a psychosomatic illness, and Frankie kills Louis during their earlier scuffle. The book also ends with Frankie committing suicide because he's reached the end of his rope. Instead, in the movie, the police suspect Frankie because everyone still thinks Zash can't walk, and she refuses to tell the truth. Which isn't to say she sells Frankie out, mind you, it's just that she's a terrible liar. The cops decide to wait for Frankie to surface when he starts needing a fix, but instead he's gone to find Molly, to beg her for money the way her ex-boyfriend used to. Frankie is absolutely desperate at this point, and it's not very pretty. But then Molly's pushy ex-boyfriend shows up and mentions that everyone thinks Frankie killed Louis. Once Molly gets rid of him, Frankie says he didn't kill him, but that he'd probably say anything to the cops for a quick fix, what with the state he's in. Molly talks him into going clean, cold turkey, and Frankie explains that she'll need to be prepared. She needs to lock him in her room and hide everything sharp, because as bad as it's been for him, it's only going to get worse. What follows is... I don't know if I'd say the withdrawal scene is as good as Trainspotting, but it's up there. And of course, Trainspotting had Golden Arm to use as a reference. I will say, though, that Sinatra puts on one hell of a performance here. When Frankie is finally feeling better, the ex-boyfriend spots him looking out the window, and the police show up soon after. However, Frankie has already gone out to see Zash one last time before he turns himself in. He explains to her that he won't be coming back even if he beats the murder charge, because he obviously needs a completely clean break from his old life if he wants to avoid another relapse. This sets off Zash again, and in a panic she gets out of bed and runs to him just as the detective from earlier shows up. The detective only says, "Get dressed, Zash," but you can tell from his expression that he's thinking, well, now everything adds up. Instead of going quietly, however, Zash makes a break for the fire escape and then falls 4 floors to her death. The movie ends with Frankie and Molly walking away as Sparrow watches. Final thoughts. The Man with the Golden Arm was quite unique for the time in the way it provided a compassionate look at someone suffering from an opioid addiction. Frankie is in many ways as much of a victim as Louis or Molly. The victim of a disease so insidious it changes the very nature of the brain it inhabits. There's no dichotomy between mind and body, you know? Your consciousness and your personality are just as physical as your liver and your lungs. That's how addiction can be a disease, even though it's based in large part on the decisions we make. Free will and addiction, they bleed into one another. The post-war period was marked by a rise in drug addictions. Not just to morphine and heroin, the first of which was used a bit too often as a painkiller for injured soldiers and led to Book Frankie's addiction, but also to other painkillers, to tranquilizers, to uppers and downers. Post-traumatic stress was poorly understood at the time, and so returning veterans with PTSD symptoms were often medicated with morphine and sleeping pills, much like what we saw in that one newspaper vignette. Dr. Harlan Fontaine may come off as a sleazy snake oil salesman, but he's also very much a representative of his profession at the time, especially considering the way Hollywood psychiatrists supplied the addictive pills it took to keep actors going during their unforgiving film schedules. Even today we've got problems with victim blaming when it comes to addictions. I mean, it's not like you're supposed to forgive and forget so that an addict can go on ruining his or her life until it comes to an untimely end. But If you go around condemning people for falling to addiction or falling into a relapse, you're not going to help them by cutting them off completely and refusing to support them when they need support to quit. You can't force someone out of an addiction, but at the same time, almost every recovering addict needs outside help and support to put an addiction behind them. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope you'll join me next time for a film about the rise and fall of a gangster famous for a certain scar.